Ilara stood in the grand candle-lit drawing-room of Thornwood Hall, a crystal glass of untouched champagne growing warm in her hand, and realized she had become invisible. Not in the way of magic or myth, in the way a woman disappears when her husband has not glanced at her once in 3 hours, in the way a duchess fades when every guest in the room understands she holds a title but no affection. The dinner party swirled around her. Silk rustled. Laughter rose and fell in practiced waves. Lord and Lady Pemberton were holding court near the fireplace. Sir William was droning on about some hunting expedition. And at the center of everything stood Alexander Ashford, the Duke of Thornwood, her husband of 2 years, listening to a beautiful widow with more attention than he had ever given his own wife. Ilara watched the way his dark head inclined, the way his mouth almost curved. A sharp, quiet ache bloomed beneath her ribs. She pressed her palm against the stem of her glass until the cut crystal bit into her skin. A woman beside her murmured to a companion just loud enough to carry. "It is rather sad, is it not? He simply never looks at her. I do wonder why he married her at all." The companion whispered back, "I heard it was a matter of obligation. Some old debt to her father, such a pity." The words landed like small, precise stones. Ilara did not flinch. She had trained herself not to. She simply set down the glass, smoothed the front of her pale gray gown, and walked toward the terrace doors as though she had every intention of enjoying the evening air. No one stopped her, no one noticed. Outside, the autumn night wrapped around her like cold silk. She stood at the stone balustrade and stared out at the dark gardens, her breath misting faintly. In the distant past, when she had first arrived at Thornwood Hall as a hopeful bride, she had imagined walking these gardens on her husband's arm. She had imagined quiet conversations under the stars. She had imagined his hand reaching for hers in the darkness. 2 years had taught her to stop imagining. Something inside her cracked that night. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small, clean fracture. The part of her that had been waiting, hopping, praying for a scrap of warmth simply let go. She did not weep. She was far too tired for tears. She simply stood until the chill seeped through her satin slippers, then turned and walked inside with her spine straight and her chin lifted. She was done begging with her eyes. The days that followed unrolled quietly. Ilara began to change in ways so small that no one noticed at first. She stopped lingering at the breakfast table in the hope that Alexander would appear. She stopped loitering in the east corridor near his study, pretending to arrange flowers just to catch a glimpse of him. She stopped wearing the deep blue gown he had once offhandedly remarked was tolerable, dressing instead in soft greens and lavenders that made her own quiet beauty bloom without his approval. The housekeeper, Mrs. Harrow, was the first to observe the shift. She had watched the young Duchess wilt for 2 years with a loyal servant's helpless heart. Now she saw her ladyship rise early, walk the grounds alone, and return with pink cheeks and a clear gaze. She saw her spend hours at the small writing desk in the morning room, not writing letters to her distant family, but sketching plans. "Are you quite well, Your Grace?" Mrs. Harrow asked one afternoon. Ilara looked up from a neat diagram. "Yes, Mrs. Harrow, I am thinking about the village children. There are so many who cannot read or write. The vicar tells me some of the tenant families want learning for their sons and daughters but have no schoolhouse within miles. I think I shall open one, here on the estate." The housekeeper blinked. "Is His Grace aware?" "Not yet, but I am certain he will not object. He rarely concerns himself with my occupations." The words were spoken without bitterness, which made them all the more cutting. Mrs. Harrow curtsied and withdrew, a strange ache in her throat. Ilara threw herself into the work like a woman drowning reaching for driftwood. She visited the steward to discuss the unused cottage on the South Meadow. She wrote to a charitable society in London requesting donated primers. She met with tenant families, listening carefully to their needs. Her gracefulness had always been natural, but now a quiet confidence began to edge into her voice. The villagers started to smile when they saw her walking down the lane. Children tugged their forelocks shyly and received warm words in return. Weeks passed. Autumn surrendered to a cold, crisp winter. Ilara's schoolhouse became real. The cottage was repaired, whitewashed walls gleaming, a small stove installed for warmth. She hired a gentle young woman from the village to teach alongside her. The first morning classes began with 7 children, then 14, then 20. Their eager voices filled the little building with chanting letters and simple sums. Ilara found herself laughing for the first time in months. Not the polite, restrained laugh she used in drawing rooms, but a true, bright sound when a tiny girl named Bess proudly read an entire sentence aloud. That laugh startled her. It felt foreign and precious, like a forgotten heirloom discovered in an attic. It was also the moment Alexander Ashford noticed something had changed. He was riding back from a meeting with his land agent when his horse's path took him near the south meadow. The sound of children singing drifted across the frosty air. He drew rein, frowning. Through the bare trees, he saw the cottage with its windows lit and the door propped open despite the cold. A woman stood in the doorway, wrapped in a dark cloak, and when she turned to wave goodbye to a departing child, he realized it was his wife. He did not recognize the expression on her face. It was soft, peaceful. She looked like a woman who had found a purpose that had nothing to do with him. Something hot and uncomfortable tightened in his chest. He urged his horse forward without stopping to speak to her. That evening, Alexander found himself lingering in the great hall when Ilara returned. She came in smelling of wood smoke and cold air, a smudge of chalk dust on her sleeve. She paused when she saw him, and for the first time in their marriage, she did not move toward him. "Good evening, Alexander," she said calmly, and would have passed on toward the staircase. "I saw you today," he said, his voice clipped. "At the old forester's cottage. What were you doing there?" Ilara turned back. "I have opened a school for the estate children. I did inform your steward, and he approved the use of the cottage. I hope that does not displease you." It did not displease him. Something else displeased him, something he could not name. He stared at her, trying to reconcile this composed woman with the hopeful girl who used to watch him with desperate, shining eyes. Where had that light gone? When had it extinguished? "You might have informed me directly," he said. "Would it have interested you?" The question hung in the air, simple and devastating. He had no answer. He had never given her a reason to think it would interest him. She waited for a heartbeat, then inclined her head gracefully and went upstairs. Alexander stood alone in the hall, the echo of her footsteps fading into silence. Winter deepened. Ilara's school grew. She began visiting tenants more frequently, listening to their troubles, advocating for them with the steward. The household staff noticed a shift in the way she carried herself. She was no longer the Duchess who drifted through the halls like an apologetic ghost. She was the Duchess who had things to do and people who depended on her. And Alexander, despite himself, began to notice too. He noticed her absence at breakfast, which had once been a relief and now felt hollow. He noticed that she no longer left small, hopeful tokens in his study: a fresh flower, a warm pastry, a short note in her elegant hand. He noticed that her laugh, that rare sound he had once dismissed as nervous and girlish, was now heard elsewhere in the kitchens, the garden, the village lane. He heard it through an open window one morning, when she was playing with a tenant's baby, and something in his chest pulled tight as a drumhead. He did not like it. He did not understand it. The arrival of Lord Julian Harcourt in late January threw his confusion into sharp, painful relief. Julian was an old childhood friend, a second son who had spent the last 5 years abroad in Italy and the East. He returned to England with a sun-browned face, laughing eyes, and a complete indifference to the chilly formality of aristocratic society. Alexander had always liked Julian's easy charm. Now, within 3 days of his arrival at Thornwood Hall, he found himself fighting the urge to hit him. It began innocently. Julian was the sort of man who talked to everyone from duchesses to scullery maids with genuine interest. When he first met Alara at dinner, he did not glance past her as so many others did. He looked at her directly, smiled, and said, "I have heard about your school from one of the grooms. He says his little girl can now write her own name. That is remarkable, Your Grace." Alara's cheeks flushed with surprised pleasure. "Thank you, Lord Harcourt. The children are the ones who deserve the praise. They work very hard." "Even so, a school does not build itself. You must tell me all about it. I have seen village schools in Tuscany that could learn a great deal from English determination." They fell into easy conversation. Alara spoke about the children, her future plans, her small victories. Julian listened with the kind of attention that made a woman feel seen. Across the table, Alexander gripped his fork and chewed his roast lamb without tasting it. The following afternoon, he saw them walking together in the frozen rose garden. Julian was showing her a small carved box he had brought from Constantinople. Alara laughed at something he said, that same bright, true laugh Alexander had heard through the window. She looked younger, lighter, happy. Alexander's jaw tightened until his teeth ached. That night he found himself lingering near the drawing room after dinner, watching his wife and his friend play a quiet game of chess. Julian made a deliberately foolish move just to make her smile. She saw through it immediately and chided him with gentle amusement. The intimacy of the moment, the easy warmth between them, clawed at Alexander's insides like a trapped animal. He retreated to his study and poured himself a brandy he did not want. He could not name the feeling gnawing at him. He had never wanted her attention, had he? He had spent 2 years avoiding it. Why, then, did the sight of her giving it to another man feel like a theft? Days later, a small but piercing incident cemented his turmoil. He came downstairs early one morning and saw a letter on the silver salver in the hall, addressed to Alara in a bold, masculine hand. He recognized Julian's writing. Without pausing to consider the morality of it, he picked up the letter and held it. He did not open it. He simply stood there, holding the paper, while a cold, ugly wave of possessiveness washed through him. When Alara appeared and saw the letter, she smiled and took it from his unresisting fingers. "From Lord Harcourt," she said lightly. "He promised to send me a list of educational texts he saw used in Vienna. He is very thoughtful." She walked away reading the letter, and Alexander watched her go with the uncomfortable realization that he had just felt something he had never expected to feel for his quiet, neglected wife. Jealousy, deep, irrational, burning jealousy. The following Sunday, he found himself escorting her to church for the first time in months, not because she had asked, but because he had abruptly announced his intention to attend. Alara had looked surprised but merely nodded. They walked together in silence, a space of cold air between them. In the churchyard afterward, Julian appeared at Alara's side as naturally as sunlight. He complimented her bonnet. She teased him about his lack of a proper winter coat. Alexander stood a few feet away, ignored, feeling like a monument no one cared to look at. A pair of elderly village women observed the scene and exchanged knowing glances. The Duchess was blooming under the attention of a kind gentleman. The Duke was watching like a man who had just discovered a locked door in his own house. That evening, Alexander did something he had not done in 2 years. He sought her out. She was in the small music room, not playing the pianoforte, but mending a torn primer by candlelight. The needle moved in and out with steady precision. She looked up when he entered, and again, that polite, unhopeful expression settled over her features. "Alexander, did you need something?" He closed the door behind him. The click of the latch felt loud in the quiet room. "I need to understand," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "why you never told me you were doing all this. The school, the tenants. You have transformed half the estate's charity work, and I learned of it from my land agent." Alara set down the primer. "Would you have wished to hear it from me? Every time I tried to speak with you in the past, you found a reason to leave the room. I learned my lesson. I assumed my activities were beneath your interest." The words were gentle, but they cut like a knife. He took a step closer, then stopped. I never said you were beneath my interest. No, she agreed softly. You never said it. You simply showed it every day. And I have finally learned to accept that truth instead of fighting it. What? Something desperate clawed at his throat. Ilara. She stood, smoothing her skirts. It is all right, Alexander. I am not angry. I am not asking for anything. I am simply at peace. I have my work. I have friends. I am content. You do not need to trouble yourself. She left the room, her footsteps steady. He stood frozen, the word content echoing in his mind like a death knell. She was content. Content without him. He had spent 2 years pushing her away, and now she had stopped seeking him entirely. It was the loneliest feeling he had ever known. Spring crept over Thornwood in pale greens and soft rains. Ilara's school celebrated its 100th lesson. She hosted a small tea for the tenant mothers, and the village buzzed with affection for the young duchess who actually listened to their troubles. Julian was a constant, cheerful presence, helping her with heavy boxes of books, drawing the children's laughter with funny faces, never once overstepping propriety but always somehow there. Alexander watched it all from a growing distance that he himself had created. He began to understand the shape of his own folly. For 2 years, a good woman had loved him, and he had treated her devotion as an inconvenience. Now that devotion had been placed on a shelf she no longer reached for. He saw her warmth directed at villagers, at servants, at his friend, and he ached with the knowledge that none of it was for him anymore. One evening in April, the second unexpected emotional reveal tore his world apart. He was in the library searching for an old estate document among his late father's papers. His father had been a reckless man, leaving behind tangled finances that Alexander had spent a decade repairing. There was a particular debt, a ruinous sum owed to a London bank, that had nearly broken the estate 5 years ago. Alexander had managed to pay it off through strict economies, or so he had always believed. Now, deep in a dusty ledger he had never closely examined, he found a folded sheet of vellum. It was a deed of payment, dated shortly after his marriage to Ilara. The sum was the exact amount of that old debt, and the payer was not himself. It was Ilara Vance Ashford, using the entirety of her personal inheritance. His hands trembled as he read the document again. His mind raced back. He remembered his steward mentioning that a mysterious final payment had cleared the debt, but he had been too relieved to question it. He had assumed some old investment of his father's had matured. He had never, not once, suspected his wife. She had given every penny of her inheritance to save his estate. While he had been coldly ignoring her, she had been silently rescuing him, and she had never spoken a word of it. He found her an hour later in the small sitting room she had claimed as her own. She was reading a letter, her expression soft. He entered without knocking, the deed clutched in his hand, his face white. "What is this?" His voice cracked. Ilara looked up, saw the paper, and something flickered in her eyes. Not guilt, not triumph, just a quiet old sadness. "You were not meant to find that. You paid my father's debt." He took a shaky step forward. "You used your inheritance, all of it. You left yourself with nothing. Why?" She folded the letter on her lap, her fingers very still. "Because you were drowning. I could see it in your eyes, though you never spoke to me of it. I overheard you arguing with your solicitor one night, and I understood. You were going to lose everything your family had built." She paused. "I did it because I loved you. I thought perhaps, if you knew the estate was safe, you might one day find room for me in your heart. But I realized later that buying your gratitude was not the same as earning your love. So I kept silent. It was a gift. Gifts should not come with chains." The word chains undid him. He had once, in a moment of cruel frustration early in their marriage, told a friend that the marriage felt like a chain. He had not known she was within earshot. He had never apologized. "You heard me say that," he whispered, horrified. "Yes," her voice was calm. "I heard many things over 2 years, but I survived them. I am quite strong, you know." He crossed the room and dropped to his knees before her chair, a position no duke should assume, but he did not care. Alara, I have been blind, arrogant, cruel, and you saved me. You saved everything and I punished you for it. She looked down at him, and for the first time in many months he saw a glimmer of the old tenderness in her gaze. But it was guarded now, distant. Please stand up, Alexander. You do not need to kneel. I did not tell you because I do not want your gratitude born of guilt. I have learned to live without your love. I will be quite all right. Her calm acceptance was worse than any anger. He reached for her hand, and after a moment she let him take it. I do not want you to live without my love, he said, his voice raw. I want you to have it, all of it, if it is not too late. She did not answer. She simply looked at him with those clear, steady eyes that no longer held desperate hope, and he realized the terrible truth. He might indeed be too late. 2 days later, the final blow landed. A letter arrived from a solicitor in Bath, informing the Duke of Thornwood that his aunt, Lady Margaret Helmsley, had passed away. She had left instructions for a sealed letter to be delivered to him personally. Alexander had not seen his aunt in 3 years. She had been a bitter, manipulative woman who had always disapproved of his independence. He had severed ties with her long before his marriage. He opened the letter with cold fingers. It was a confession. Lady Margaret wrote that she had orchestrated the compromising situation that forced his marriage to Alara. She had invited Alara to a house party 2 years ago, knowing Alexander would be present. She had maneuvered the innocent girl into a private library where Alexander, grieving and half-drunk after a quarrel with his aunt, had been resting. She had then sent servants to discover them alone together. The scandal had erupted. Alara's father, already drowning in shame from his gambling losses, had begged Alexander to do the honorable thing. Alexander, believing Alara had deliberately trapped him, had agreed to the marriage out of cold duty. But Alara had been as much a victim as he was. She had never schemed. She had never wanted a forced marriage. She had been an innocent girl caught in a web she did not spin, and she had endured 2 years of silent punishment for a crime she never committed. The letter fell from Alexander's hands. He stood in his study, shaking, while the full weight of his injustice crushed him. He had believed the worst of her from the very first day. He had married her with resentment already planted in his heart, and she had known. She had carried the knowledge of his contempt along with her own innocence, and she had never once defended herself. He found her in the school cottage, helping little Bess with her letters. The children scattered at the look on his face. Alara rose slowly, dusting her hands. "What has happened? You look as though you have seen a ghost." He could barely speak. "My Aunt Margaret, she is dead. She left a letter." He swallowed hard. "Alara, that night at the house party, the library, she arranged it all. She trapped you. She trapped us both." Alara went very still. Color drained from her cheeks. "I know," she said at last, so quietly he nearly missed it. He stared. "You knew." "I suspected. My father was too ashamed to explain, but I pieced it together later. Lady Margaret made it quite clear to me after the wedding in her own way that I had been useful. I chose not to dwell on it. It would have changed nothing." "It would have changed everything." His voice broke. I blamed you. All this time I blamed you, and you said nothing. Why did you let me believe the worst?" Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "Because you would not have believed me. You had already decided what sort of woman I was. I saw it in your eyes on our wedding day. I thought, if I am patient, if I am good, if I love you enough, you might eventually see the truth. But I waited too long, Alexander. I used up all my hope." A sob tore from his chest. He crossed the small room and took her shoulders, his grip desperate and gentle all at once. "Then let me give you new hope, please. I know I do not deserve it. I know I have been a fool, a cold-hearted, blind fool. But I love you. I love you, Alara. I think I have loved you for a long time, but I was too proud and too wounded to see it. I am not proud anymore. I am just a man who cannot bear the thought of losing you." She looked at him for a long, trembling moment. The children's chalk drawings fluttered on the walls. The little stove crackled softly. "You hurt me," she said, her voice finally breaking. "Every day, for 2 years. It did not happen in one cruel moment. It was 1,000 small cuts. I do not know if I can simply forget." "I am not asking you to forget. I am asking you to let me help you heal. Let me try. Let me be the husband I should have been from the start." He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing the tears that had begun to slip down her cheeks. "I will wait for you this time, however long it takes. I will earn your trust again if you will let me." She closed her eyes. A long, shuddering breath escaped her. "I am tired of being lonely, Alexander." "So am I," he whispered. "And it is my own fault, please. Give me a chance to fill the silence." She did not answer with words, but she did not pull away. She let him hold her, there in the cottage that smelled of chalk and wood smoke and small, hopeful things. The healing came slowly, as true healing always does. Alexander did not push. He did not demand. He simply began to show up. He visited the school and read stories to the children until they stopped being shy of the tall, stern Duke. He walked with Alara in the gardens, learning to listen to her thoughts without offering cold corrections. He brought her tea in the library and sat beside her while she worked on her lesson plans, his presence a quiet offering. When Julian departed for London in May, he clasped Alexander's hand and said, with a knowing smile, "Take care of her. She is one of the finest women I have ever met." "I know," Alexander said. "I finally know." Summer came and the estate bloomed. Alara slowly, cautiously began to open the doors of her heart again. One evening in June, as they sat on the terrace watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, she slipped her hand into his without a word. He turned to her, his throat tight. "I used to dream of this," she said softly, "sitting with you just like this. I am sorry it took me so long to join you." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You are here now." He pressed a kiss to her hair. "I am here now, and I am not going anywhere." The following spring, a new wing was added to the schoolhouse, funded entirely by the Duke of Thornwood. At the dedication ceremony, he stood beside his wife, his hand resting at the small of her back in a gesture of quiet pride. The villagers cheered. The children sang. And Alara looked up at the man who had once been a stranger in her own home and saw the love shining in his eyes, steady and sure. It had been a long winter, but spring had come at last, and it was warm, and it was real, and it was theirs.